My name is Hannah May. I am actually an IT recruiter by day and a super newbie Python developer by night. I just started my coding journey, and I'll kind of tell you guys a few things about what I've been using. But really, this presentation is kind of about the absolute beginner's struggle to just wrap their head around software development in general. I, in particular, picked Python because it's the most human-readable programming language, and I'll explain that here in a second. But what I have found helpful is kind of stepping back and taking a look at programming through the lens of spoken languages, because the way you go about learning them is sort of similar, and I've always been really quick to pick up spoken languages, which is another reason I kind of got into software development, figuring that it would be a fun, easier transition for me. So today we're going to just do a very basic comparison of like, hey, here's how you start learning a spoken language. Why don't you look at learning a software language in the same aspect? So first disclaimer, this is not a tutorial in Python, so I'm not going to be showing you a whole lot of code. I'm sorry if that's why you're listening to me in the first place. This is more to help people understand how to wrap their head around software development with Python in particular. This is kind of just an approach to learn it through comparison of something else. And my goal here is to make this a little bit less overwhelming and reduce like the entry barrier to software development. I think a lot of people get intimidated because they have no background in computers, no background in software development at all. And you sort of just get overwhelmed with this like deer in the headlights, where do I even start trying to do this? Thinking of it this way really gave me an aha moment, because as I was going through like Code Academy and Udemy, I kept thinking like, why are they having me do this? They haven't really explained how this all fits into the big picture. Once I started thinking of it as like a spoken language, it really just helped it click for me. I will say that experienced software developers are probably going to hate me for some of the comparisons I'm going to use in this. This is not meant to be a one-to-one comparison. If you're a purist, you might have some issues with how I'm making these comparisons. My partner certainly does. He is an experienced software developer, and I was like, just take a step back. I'm a beginner. Try to help me this way. And then he kind of understood when I explained it that way. So. You want to learn software development, eh? So a lot of people don't really know what language to start with, because there's so many wonderful languages that you can start with and a ton of resources for them. Python is pretty simple to learn with because it's the most human readable, meaning you can look at Python code and get a pretty good idea of what it's doing for the most part. Obviously, you still need to have some coding knowledge, but it's pretty easy to get the gist of it. Kind of spoken language-wise, and this is really going to depend on what your first language was, but for example, if you spoke English first, it's pretty easy to transition to like Spanish or Italian or French, because they're based on the same base language. And if you want to be really hard on yourself, you can learn something with a totally different alphabet, like Russian or Chinese or something like that. So that was kind of my like comparison. Oh, Python is like learning Spanish. If you already know English, you'll have a pretty good foundation in it. Now, there are some advantages to learning different languages like C or C++ or Java. A lot of universities start with these languages in their computer science courses. And this is a big debate in the coding world as far as what beginners should learn and why. Some of the reasons are some of those languages are a little bit more strongly typed. It's harder to change things later in your code once you've already established them. Again, I'm a beginner, so if some of this sounds dumb, feel free to come up to me later and tell me otherwise. I think something else to remember as you're first learning, depending on your framework or your IDE or whether you're using a text editor, some of those do a whole lot for you in the background that you may not realize. So I encourage you to try learning software development in a couple of different ways, just so that you don't kind of take for granted some of the things that these tools do for you automatically, like loading functions for you in a preset way, or doing things in the background for you that you don't have to think about day to day, but some people may argue that that doesn't make you a well-rounded software developer. So I would encourage you to kind of like look at what IDEs and those tools do for you if you're using some of the more robust tools and frameworks first to learn. So if you're a total beginner with dev, like I am, like I've never coded before, I've always been like good with tech in that I can fix my mom's iPhone, but like I don't really know computers or things like that. You may be wondering, like, where do I actually start? How do I wrap my head around this? And when I first got into Code Academy and Udemy, which are all fantastic, and I will talk to you at length about those later if you want. What I found is that they dive straight into, hey, here's a print statement and how to write one, without really giving you like the broad, hey, here are all the things we're going to learn and how they fit together. Here's where we're going to start. think back to learning to riding a bike, or maybe your first cashier job and they're teaching you how to use the register. Typically that person was like, okay, so here's a bike and it's got wheels and a seat and handlebars and brakes and this is what they do. And then they teach you like how to use those individual things to like bring the whole thing full spectrum. So trying to break it down into little pieces. So think when you're learning a spoken language, what do you typically learn first? You usually learn like your colors and your numbers and the names of your family members and things like that. Stuff that like, that's not the most important thing of learning a language, speaking a language every day, but those are the easy building blocks to start with. So there's a lot going on, you know, when you're having a conversation or writing a paper or writing a book. And you know, language teachers usually aren't going to say, well, hey kids, there's nouns and verbs and adjectives and phrases and conjunctions and sentences and compound and all this. They start with the simple things and then explain up to you. It's kind of inherent knowledge you already know too, especially if you're like just learning your second spoken language. You know that there's verbs and adjectives and this, that, and the other, but you don't concern yourself too much right then and there with that in the beginning. So as you're going with programming, you're learning more and more abstract pieces, how to string those together, when to use one over another and why, what some best practices are around that, and it all depends on like what you're doing, what you're building, who your audience is, what your tool set is. So I figure, you know, learning software development like you would a spoken language is a really helpful lens to look at it through, just because it's, you know, computers and programming languages is a really complicated abstract topic, and it's hard to wrap your head around if you don't come from that kind of a background. So if most people know at least how to say like 1, 2, 3 or the alphabet in another language, so I figure it's a pretty good way to go about that. So very super simple, broad overview of the building blocks, like high level in Python, what it's made of. So like basic data types, you've got integers, which are just nice round whole numbers, floating point numbers that have a decimal. You've got booleans, strings, conditional statements, so like if this, then this, or if something else, then you do this. Functions, lists, dictionaries, loops, classes, a whole lot more. These little building blocks put together, interacting with another, make a big piece of software. So syntax is obviously incredibly important with programming, as well as spoken languages. So you may have one goal in mind to do or say one specific thing. There's a lot of correct ways to get there or achieve that result. And programming is the same way. So there's a lot of ways to get to the same place through different syntax. So something that I kind of was getting hung up on in the beginning was doing it exactly the same as, you know, Code Academy was telling me to do it. But then I went to Udemy and it was telling me to do it a different way. And I'm looking at my boyfriend like, wait, it told me to do it this way, and what's right, what's wrong? There's a whole lot of ways to get to the same area. So, you know, someone says, introduce yourself, you can say, hey, my name's Hannah May, or my name is Hannah, or they call me Hannah May, or around these parts I'm known as the formidable Hannah May. Lots of ways to say the same thing with basically the same intent and feeling, right? Or math, 2 + 2 = 4, 2 × 2 = 4, 1 + 2 + 1 is 4, 5 - 1 is 4, 8 divided by 2 is 4, lots of different ways to get to the same area. So like in programming, like a print statement, for example, you could just put print, parentheses, quotes, my name is Hannah, and when you run that code, sorry, I'm not in like a text editor or anything to do it, that's just gonna print, my name is Hannah. Or you could establish a variable, sorry, that's capitalized, name equals Hannah, and then print name plus the string is my name. It's gonna print my name is Hannah. So same concept, you have an intent or goal to get to, there's lots of ways to get to that. They're all pretty much right, and maybe it's a little bit better if you're using one particular tool set or way to get there. So speaking of 1, 2, 3s and ABCs, with spoken language, like I said earlier, usually you learn your numbers, your letters, colors, family names, things like that. Really small, concrete pieces of what actually make up a complex language of ideas that interact with each other. So like the data types I just went over, just basic stuff, integers, floating numbers, Boolean strings. Once you have a really good feel for these, which is why all these like Code Academy and Udemy and stuff start with that, then you start to learn how those interact in more complicated ways to make more eloquent statements and complex items. So for example, a simple sentence, you've got like a noun, verb, and adjectives, that book is interesting. All those alone are just simple itty-bitty little things, but you put them together to make a sentence, a complete thought. Or maybe you have bigger chunks that are made up of smaller things, but you have to string all those chunks together. So the library's that way, but there's construction on 235 as always, so you should take I-44 instead. Now you have a complete thought strung together with all those smaller things. So like with code, you looking at this just sentence, you're like, wow, that's a whole lot. You're defining a function, its parameters, what the conditional statements to go those parameters are, what to do, depending on what the output of those parameters is going to be. And so there's actually a whole lot going on in this code, but it's really just small little pieces that you strung together. So you define your function. So my function example, x and y. And so my if statement, if x is less than y, we're just going to print x is less than y. And if it's not, if it's something else, then printing x is not less than y. So using my example of 2 and 3, it's going to print me x is less than y. If I put 4 and 2, it's going to say x is not less than y. So you see how you put a bunch of little tiny things together and you make a complicated picture, just like putting individual words together in phrases into compound sentences and into a paragraph to a chapter of a book to an entire book that you use to defend a thesis statement. Small things turn into big complex ideas. Like I said, to string together a big, more complicated piece. So the more you do this and the more you program, or the more you learn another language and learn the smaller pieces of it, the stronger you're going to get there, and you can capitalize on that to build more efficient code or build a more eloquent campaign speech. And it's the same thing with spoken language. Some people have incredible communication skills that they can take advantage of and benefit them. So, having a lot of power in few words, getting a stronger point across than being really wordy and verbose and saying the same thing over and over. So it's the same thing with coding. And every coder is a little different. They have a different accent or style. You may have 2 different pieces of code, and one is 1,000 lines longer, but it does the exact same thing. That's just that person's style. And maybe they were newer and they didn't know there was a more efficient way to do it, but they got to the same type of result. Something else I've kind of got hung up on for me right in the beginning was versions of programming languages, because when I first started, I used Code Academy, which taught in Python 2. And it had like a little disclaimer, and it was like, hey, we're teaching you Python 2, but most things use Python 3. And I was like, well, what? I was like scared. I was like, what if I do something dumb because it's Python 2 and someone's like, you should be using Python 3 for that? And no idea what any of the differences were. And so what I kind of compared that to was dialects of spoken languages. And if you speak Spanish or Chinese, you know that there's just a ton of different dialects that could be really, really similar, depending on a whole lot of factors. It could be location, it could be historical context. So for example, like the word goat in Spanish, and I'm not going to go into different exact meanings here. Spanish-speaking country to Spanish-speaking country, just the word goat could mean a lot of different things. That could mean an actual goat, an animal. It could actually mean like the meat of that animal. Like if you say goat in Guatemala, they're thinking like, okay, goat burgers, I'm hungry, like when is dinner? In another country, that could mean like a very nasty way to tell someone they're a jerk. So kind of similar to programming. There's going to be different dialects and things. So like in Python 2 to 3, some things are updated to be more resilient. Libraries have been added, deprecating old libraries into newer ones, or using like a simpler, like shorter way of typing out the same function, so you have like less lines of code that accomplish the same thing, so you run into less errors later. And so just like with spoken languages, programming languages change with the times. They evolve as the language becomes more sophisticated, or as things change in the world or in the industry. As we learn better ways to do things, our programming evolves too to become more sophisticated. So kind of just be aware, pay attention what's different from version to version of your chosen programming languages, especially if you're going to have it being integrated with some other tools. There could be little nuances of what's going on there that may throw back errors and things like that in your code. So just kind of being aware of that. Commenting your code. This was like for some reason for me, it was just a weird idea when I first started learning to code. I didn't understand what all the hashtags were, and then, I kind of just compared that to, say you're reading a book, and I'm a nerd, so I read a whole lot of like scientific journals and articles and stuff. There's always like footnotes, or direct you to another paper, another appendix or article or things like that. You don't have to necessarily, you don't have to read it, but it'll give you good context and a better understanding of underlying concepts or principles or whatever it's referring back to. And this is going to be the recruiter in me coming out. Please comment your code well. This could be the difference between you getting a job or not. So in commenting your code, this is really critical for if someone else is checking out your work. Your comment is telling them what that piece of code does and what it functions as. So you want to try to, because I've seen some examples of code that were just like, how did you think anyone knew what that meant? Because if it's in your own language or slang, or you're being really vague with your comments, they're not going to know. Just like you're not going to see a scientist in their paper about neurotransmitter uptake mechanisms of mammals. if they're referring back to some other article that's just awful and only another scientist can understand, your reader may completely lose sight of what additional context this is adding to your article. So when you are doing code, try to make sure that your comments are, they're not vague, they're well thought out, they're easy to understand by anyone else that's jumping in, whether they're trying to do code review, find bugs in your code, help you scale it, help you maintain it. This is gonna be extremely helpful. And as far as getting like a job and wanting to put your code out there like on GitHub, you wanna make sure that's easy to follow along and well commented so that anyone can go look at that and say, wow, this person has got well thought out work, easy to understand and follow code. You know, this is the kind of person I wanna hire into my environment. So that's the little recruiter coming out in me with commenting your code being kind of like footnotes. Something else that I think a lot of beginners get hung up with, and admittedly, like I had a little bit better feel for it because I've just been in the recruiting world, so you get a lot of, you know, I've already been heard and been trained on like different stacks and what this means and what that and what goes with different jobs. But I've talked to some other beginner developers that are like, I just have, what does the stack mean? What does it mean to be a full stack developer, a back end or a front end, or what is mean versus LAMP? You're gonna run into this quite a bit. So as far as like the stack, you've got an operating system, a web server, a database, and a language you're using. And these aren't necessarily strict. You can have other tools and pieces in the environment, but like LAMP stack, for example, you're working in Linux, an Apache web server, and MySQL database, and PHP language. But you know, you've got other languages and tools that fit within that, CSS, HTML, JavaScript, etc. In spoken language, there's a really good example of this, and I personally love this. So we speak English, but of course there's a ton of like French words that we use that we don't have an English form for. Or Yiddish, there's a whole lot of Yiddish words that we use in the English language that even though we're speaking English, it's not constrained to just English. It's gonna be pretty understanding if you say, hey, I need a skosh of salt in this recipe, or you're using something that is not English, people understand what it is. So I try to, like when I'm talking to newer developers and they're concerned about what stack am I, just understand like that's your environment and the tools you have, but there's more that goes along with that. And a lot of people are, you know, I'm a full stack developer, I'm back end, you know, I try to tell beginners not to get too hung up on that and just like do what's fun and do what you enjoy. Just like you don't have to learn only scientific Spanish. You don't have to only learn Spanish as it relates to you know, like the dentistry profession or whatever. You learn the whole thing and then the different pieces and nuances that come with the more specialized bits of it. And this is what I would kind of compare to, like if you're visiting another country, and since I speak a good deal of Spanish, I just keep using Spanish in my examples. When you go to another Spanish-speaking country, you kind of want to know what their little nuances are. So in the day, you know it's Spanish, their operating system, so to speak. They have a different accent on certain letters. Like if you're in Spain, you have a lisp, and that's because the king of Spain a long time ago had a lisp and wanted everybody to sound like him. So now everybody in Spain speaks Spanish with a little bit of a lisp. So you know that they've got different slang, different historical differences in pronunciation. So you know your environment, know your goal or what you're doing in your existing tool set, and you know don't be too strict on yourself with those constraints. So easy as 1, 2, 3, right? That's what people keep telling me. This kind of gave me just a better idea of let me take a step back, step away from my code, step away from my text editor, and just wrap my head around what I'm doing and what the big picture is. Just gave me a lot easier way to approach it. So all the awesome tools, Code Academy, Udemy, I have little asterisks here because you can pay for fancier pro versions of them. There's a ton of free stuff on YouTube. There's the boot camps, especially all the cool stuff done at Starspace. Most of these things kind of give you a syllabus of sorts, which a lot of people skip over. I encourage you to actually read that and look it over because you get that broad overview. And just take a look at that for a while so you can absorb what you're diving into first, so you understand how the small pieces fit together so you don't have as much of that what am I even doing? How does this fit into the big picture? Why does this matter later? And again, like I said, I'm a huge beginner, so maybe some of these comparisons were super weird and not helpful, but this is what helped me personally, coming from zero experience, zero background, just get myself out of my own way learning software development, just to look at it through a different lens. I'm definitely open to hearing like what was helpful for others when they first got started, or like what background you come from, because like for me, for example, I've always been like a geek and loved computers and science and math, but never been like in that profession. So I'm interested to see like where people come from as far as their backgrounds to learn to code, what you wish you knew when you first started. Also, I got into a weird like hole on Stack Overflow a little while ago about like stuff that's not in English, so like maybe programming languages that were originated in different countries and people that weren't from that country learning it, or like the different tools and IDEs they use. So if there's anyone that is listening or here today that came from a different place where English was not your first language, I'd love to learn about your specific journey and what learning software development was like for you. But like I said, super open to questions, comments, and ideas. This is my work email. You're welcome to email me. I'm also in the Techlahoma Slack. I'm really active on LinkedIn as well. And I'm usually around Starspace once or twice a week if it's a good week and I can get away. So I hope that was helpful just for people to take a step back. Also with women in particular, we're really good with spoken languages, so we should all be programmed or software developers too, right, by that logic. So thought that this would be like a good way for women to be like, oh, hey, I am really good with spoken languages. I'll try my hand at coding too. So I hope it was helpful, and thank you guys for listening and being here today. And let me know if you want to talk more about the comparison of spoken languages to software development. And that is it.